It was supposed to be a peaceful neighborhood, the kind where people greeted each other with polite waves, kids rode their bikes on the sidewalks, and life carried on without much drama. Mark had lived in his house for years, appreciating the tranquility and the little routines that made up his everyday life. His corner lot home was a sanctuary with a neat front lawn, a freshly painted mailbox, and most importantly, a private driveway that was his alone to use. That driveway wasn't just for convenience. It was a necessity, especially for his elderly mother, who often visited. The thought of her navigating the uneven sidewalk with her cane made Mark shudder. Keeping the driveway clear for her safety was a priority. At first, it seemed like a minor annoyance. Mark came home one evening to find a sleek, white SUV parked in his driveway. He frowned. His driveway had always been empty when he returned. He glanced around, wondering if it belonged to a visitor or a contractor working on a neighbor's house. With a resigned sigh, Mark walked across the street and knocked on the door of the house directly opposite his. The door swung open, revealing a woman in her mid-40s with a smug expression plastered across her face. She was dressed in yoga pants that had clearly never seen a yoga class, holding a cup of iced coffee in one hand like it was a scepter. "Oh, hi," she said in a sing-song voice, barely glancing at him. "Hi. I think you might have accidentally parked in my driveway," Mark said, keeping his voice calm and polite. "Oh, sorry about that," the woman said, her tone almost too casual. "I was just unloading groceries. I'll move it right away." True to her word, she moved the SUV, and Mark thought that was the end of it. Just a neighborly misunderstanding, nothing to get worked up about. He returned to his house, feeling slightly amused at the whole interaction. But the amusement didn't last long. A few days later, the white SUV was back in his driveway. Mark's frustration grew as the pattern repeated itself over the next several weeks. Each time, he would knock on her door, and each time, she offered the same half-hearted apology. By the third time, her excuse had evolved into, "I was only going to be a minute," despite the fact that her car had clearly been sitting there long enough to gather a layer of leaves. By the fourth time, her tone had shifted from apologetic to outright dismissive. "Come on, it's not like you're using it all the time," she said, waving him off as if he were a pesky fly buzzing around her frappuccino. "It's just easier for me to park there when I'm unloading." Mark's jaw tightened. Easier for her? This was his property, his driveway. His patience was wearing dangerously thin. It wasn't just the inconvenience. It was the sheer audacity of her behavior. He decided to document every incident from that point on, snapping pictures of her car parked in his driveway and jotting down the dates and times in a small notebook. It felt absurd, like he was starring in his own bad sitcom. But what choice did he have? He tried reasoning with her one more time. This time, she crossed her arms and smirked at him. "This isn't really your driveway, you know," she said, her sunglasses perched on her head like a tiara. "It's part of the easement." Mark stared at her, genuinely dumbfounded. "The easement is the strip of grass between the sidewalk and the curb," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The driveway is on my property." "Well, that's your opinion," she said with a dismissive shrug before flouncing back to her SUV. Mark clenched his fists, feeling a simmering rage bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't just rudeness anymore. It was a full-blown declaration of war. The tipping point came one Saturday morning when his mom was visiting. Mark had made sure the driveway was clear so she could park safely. He stepped inside for a quick cup of coffee, only to hear his mother shouting from outside. He rushed out to find the white SUV parked directly behind his mom's car, effectively blocking her in. His mom stood next to her car, hands on her hips, glaring at the SUV with a fiery intensity Mark rarely saw. "Who does this woman think she is?" his mom demanded. Mark turned to see the woman, Karen, as he now knew her name, standing nearby, gesturing wildly. "I needed the driveway for an emergency errand," she said, as if that justified her behavior. "Emergency?" Mark asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "I need to pick up cupcakes for my daughter's soccer team," Karen replied, her tone making it sound like a national crisis. Mark could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Karen, you're blocking my elderly mom in my driveway. Move your car. Now." Karen rolled her eyes so hard Mark was surprised she didn't pull a muscle. "You're being so dramatic. I'll only be 5 minutes." 5 minutes turned into 15, and by the time Karen finally moved her car, Mark was done playing nice. It was time for a new strategy. If Karen thought she could walk all over him, she was in for a rude awakening. Mark was ready to escalate, and this time, there would be no polite knocks on her door. The battle had officially begun. Mark had always considered himself a reasonable man. He believed in resolving conflicts with calm words and understanding. But Karen was a different breed, a master of entitlement wielding smugness and audacity like weapons. After the cupcake incident, Mark realized the only way to deal with someone like Karen was with strategy, precision, and a good dose of pettiness. Politeness had failed. Now it was time to escalate. He began by upgrading his defenses. Operation Document and Dominate was officially in motion. First, he installed a security camera aimed directly at the driveway. It wasn't a high-end setup, just a basic motion-activated camera he bought on sale, but it was enough to capture everything that happened in front of his house. No more relying on phone pictures and handwritten notes. He needed video evidence in case things spiraled out of control. And with Karen, they almost certainly would. The next step was to confirm his legal standing. Mark called the local zoning office to ensure he wasn't missing some obscure rule about easements and property lines. As expected, the zoning office confirmed what he already knew. His driveway was private property, not part of any easement or public space. He even had them send the confirmation in writing, just in case he needed it later. Mark smiled to himself, feeling more prepared than ever. Karen had no idea what she was about to walk into. It didn't take long for her to strike again. Just a couple of days later, Mark came home to find her SUV parked in his driveway once more. This time, however, she wasn't even home. He knocked on her door, but there was no answer. Fantastic. His groceries were melting in the trunk while her car sat smugly in his driveway. Fine, two could play this game. Mark parked his car directly behind her SUV, trapping it in the driveway. If Karen thought he was going to waste his evening hunting her down, she had another thing coming. He grabbed a notepad, scribbled a quick message, and stuck it under her windshield wiper. The note read, "Hi Karen, since you've made yourself so comfortable in my driveway, I hope you don't mind if I make myself comfortable blocking you in. Let me know when you're ready to talk like an adult." Then he went inside, grabbed a snack, and settled in for a relaxing evening of Netflix. He had barely made it through half an episode when there was loud, frantic pounding on his front door. Mark paused the show and opened the door to find Karen standing there, her face red and her arms flailing like a malfunctioning windmill. "You can't block me in," she screeched. "That's illegal." Mark leaned casually against the doorframe, doing his best impression of someone who had all the time in the world. "You're right, Karen. Blocking someone in is illegal on public property. But this is private property. You know what else is illegal? Trespassing, which is what you're doing every time you park in my driveway." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "It's not trespassing. I told you, this driveway isn't private property." Mark pulled out his phone and opened the email from the zoning office. "According to the city, it is. Would you like me to forward this to you? Or maybe to the police?" Her face twisted into a mask of panic and indignation. "You're being unreasonable. I just needed a place to park for a little while. And I just needed my driveway not to be treated like your personal parking lot." Mark shot back. "Funny how life works." Karen stormed off in a huff, muttering under her breath about reporting him. To whom? Mark had no idea. Maybe the Audacity Police or the Department of Entitlement. He chuckled and returned to his evening, assuming that would be the end of it. But he underestimated just how far Karen was willing to take things. A few days later, Mark woke up to find her car in his driveway again. This time, she had outdone herself. The SUV was parked diagonally across the driveway, taking up so much space that not even his own car could squeeze in. Mark didn't even bother knocking on her door. He was done with polite requests. It was time to bring out the big guns. He called the local towing company. "Hi," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the bubbling mix of rage and satisfaction. "I have a car parked illegally on my private property, and I need it removed." The dispatcher assured him that a truck would be there within the hour. Mark made himself a cup of coffee, grabbed a lawn chair, and settled on his porch to enjoy the show. It was a beautiful day, and there was nothing quite as satisfying as watching justice unfold in real time. The tow truck arrived right on schedule. The driver hopped out, gave Mark a nod, and got to work hooking up Karen's precious SUV. Just as the truck was about to pull away, Karen burst out of her house like a tornado in yoga pants, her arms flailing and her voice reaching a decibel level typically reserved for emergency alarms. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, running toward the truck as if auditioning for a dramatic soap opera. "You can't tow my car." The driver didn't even blink. "Ma'am, this car is parked illegally on private property. The owner of the driveway called us." Karen spun around, glaring at Mark with a look that could melt steel. "You can't do this. I'll call the police." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Please do." I'd love to explain to them why your car keeps trespassing on my property. She tried bargaining with the tow truck driver, then pleading, then yelling. None of it worked. Within minutes, the truck was pulling away, taking her SUV with it. Karen stood in the middle of the street, slack-jawed and fuming. Later that evening, Mark got a knock on his door, not from Karen this time, but from a concerned neighbor. Apparently, Karen had been going door to door trying to rally the neighborhood against him. She said you're harassing her and abusing your power as a property owner, the neighbor explained, rolling his eyes. But honestly, everyone knows what she's like. We've all dealt with her nonsense. Mark raised an eyebrow. Really? Oh yeah, the neighbor continued. She's blocked other people's driveways, used their trash bins, even let her dog poop on their lawns. Mark chuckled. Good to know. Sounds like she's making friends everywhere. It turned out Mark wasn't the only one fed up with Karen's behavior. The tide was turning, and for the first time, Karen was on the defensive. Mark could feel the shift in the air. He wasn't just fighting for his driveway anymore. He was fighting for the entire neighborhood. And with the neighbors finally standing up to her, Karen's days of unchecked entitlement were numbered. Mark thought things had finally settled down after the towing incident. Karen's precious SUV had been carted away, her audacity temporarily subdued. The neighborhood was abuzz with whispers and laughter about the incident. For a few blissful days, Mark's driveway remained Karen-free. But if Mark had learned anything about Karen, it was that she didn't back down quietly. She was like a bad sequel, unnecessary and over the top, and impossible to ignore. It all began again with a knock at Mark's door. Standing there was a police officer, and behind him, lurking with arms crossed and a smug expression, was Karen. She looked like a villain from a daytime soap opera, ready to drop her dramatic accusations. Good afternoon, the officer said, his tone calm but professional. Your neighbor here claims you've been harassing her and dumping trash on her property. Karen's eyes gleamed with fake concern as she added, I just don't feel safe anymore. He's been so aggressive ever since I parked in his driveway. I don't know what to do. She even threw in a dramatic sniffle for good measure. Mark's lips curled into a smile. He had been waiting for this moment. Officer, I'm so glad you're here, he said. Let me show you something. He pulled out his phone and opened his photo gallery. It was like a highlight reel of Karen's misdeeds. Timestamped pictures of her car parked in his driveway. Video clips from the security camera showing her dumping trash bags in front of his house. And even a shot of her old cat Tree sitting conspicuously near the curb. Karen's confident smirk began to falter. I was just trying to make a point, she stammered. He's been so rude to me. The officer held up a hand. Ma'am, I see no evidence of harassment here. But dumping trash on someone else's property, that's illegal. Mark leaned casually against the door frame, trying to suppress the urge to grin. Would you like to press charges for trespassing and illegal dumping? The officer asked, turning to Mark. Karen's jaw dropped. You can't be serious. I didn't mean any harm. Karen, Mark said, doing his best to keep a straight face. I think the officer just wants to make sure we're both following the law. Isn't that what you wanted? The officer instructed Karen to clean up the mess immediately and warned her that if she ever trespassed again, she'd be facing a fine or worse. Mark watched as Karen stomped back across the street, muttering unintelligible curses under her breath. He gave her a cheerful wave. Thanks for stopping by, Karen. For a moment, Mark thought that might be the end of it. But Karen wasn't done. Not yet. The next morning, Mark discovered a fresh pile of garbage at the end of his driveway. 3 overflowing bags, a broken chair, and what looked like an old, shredded rug. The cherry on top? A handwritten sign taped to one of the bags that read, If you don't like sharing, here's all your space back. Mark sighed, snapped a few photos, and dragged the bags back across the street to Karen's curb. He wasn't even angry anymore. At this point, documenting Karen's antics had become more of a hobby. But Karen had one last card to play. A few hours later, there was another knock at Mark's door. This time, it was one of his neighbors, looking amused and slightly exasperated. Hey, the neighbor said. So Karen's been going door to door telling everyone you're some kind of driveway dictator. Mark chuckled. Seriously? Yeah. But don't worry, the neighbor added. We've all dealt with her nonsense. Nobody's buying it. Word spread fast. It turned out that Karen had been pulling stunts like this for years, blocking other people's driveways, using their trash bins, even letting her dog roam freely onto neighbors' lawns. But Mark's stand had emboldened the rest of the neighborhood. The couple next door started locking their trash bins. Another neighbor confronted Karen about her dog. People were finally pushing back. The neighborhood had spoken, and Karen's reign of entitlement was officially over. But Karen wasn't going down without one final act of defiance. A week later, Mark woke up to find a moving truck parked in front of Karen's house. For a moment, he thought she was just redecorating, but no, she was moving out. Apparently, dealing with an entire neighborhood of people who wouldn't put up with her nonsense anymore was too much for her to handle. As the truck pulled away, Mark couldn't resist one last jab. He grabbed a piece of chalk and wrote at the end of his driveway, "Vacancy. No Karens allowed." It wasn't his finest work of art, but it made him and the neighbors laugh. If this whole experience had taught Mark anything, it was that dealing with entitled people required a mix of patience, persistence, and a willingness to stand your ground. Oh, and maybe a security camera or two. As Mark stood in his driveway, watching the moving truck disappear down the street, he smiled. His driveway was finally Karen-free, and life could return to the peaceful, quiet routine he had always loved. But he wasn't naive. He knew that where there was one Karen, there was always a chance another one might appear. And if they did, Mark was ready. For a blissful week, peace returned to the neighborhood. No more mysterious piles of garbage. No more SUVs parked diagonally across the driveway. And most importantly, no more Karen. Mark allowed himself to relax, savoring the quiet moments he'd almost forgotten existed. He even began to believe that perhaps the battle was truly over. But in life, just when you think the storm has passed, fate always seems to have one last trick up its sleeve. It started with a phone call late one evening. Mark was halfway through his favorite TV show when his phone lit up with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of him. "Hello. Hi, Mr. Thompson," the voice on the other end said. "This is Gary from the zoning office. Just wanted to follow up on the situation with your neighbor. We received an anonymous complaint about your driveway being used for illegal commercial activities." Mark blinked in disbelief. "Illegal commercial activities?" "Yes," Gary confirmed. "Something about you running an unauthorized parking business out of your home." Mark couldn't help it. He burst out laughing. "Let me guess. This complaint came from Karen." Gary chuckled awkwardly. "We can't say for sure, but let's just say we've had our share of creative complaints from that address before." Mark thanked Gary and hung up, shaking his head in disbelief. Even after moving out, Karen was still trying to stir up trouble. It was almost impressive. Almost. But Mark wasn't about to let Karen's parting shot ruin his newfound peace. He decided to make it clear to everyone that he was done playing defense. The next morning, Mark organized a small gathering of neighbors over coffee and donuts. They shared stories about their experiences with Karen, the blocked driveways, the overflowing trash bins, the wandering dog. "We've been putting up with her nonsense for too long," said Jim, the neighbor who lived 2 doors down. "Mark, you did us all a favor by standing up to her." The gathering turned into a full-blown neighborhood celebration. Someone brought a portable speaker. Another neighbor fired up a grill, and soon the air was filled with the smell of burgers and laughter. For the first time in years, the neighbors truly felt like a community, one united by their shared triumph over Karen's tyranny. But the real twist came the next day. Mark was tidying up his front yard when a car pulled up to the curb. The driver, a man in a suit with an official-looking clipboard, stepped out and approached Mark. "Mr. Thompson?" the man asked. "I'm Andrew from the City Council. We're evaluating properties for a new neighborhood initiative, and your home was nominated by several of your neighbors as an example of community leadership." Mark blinked. "Hey, what? We'd like to feature you in our upcoming newsletter and possibly in a local news segment," Andrew continued. "It seems you've made quite an impact here." Mark chuckled, still processing the unexpected turn of events. "I'm not sure about all that, but sure, why not?" The following week, Mark's story appeared in the city newsletter under the headline, "Neighborhood Hero Takes a Stand Against Entitlement." The article painted him as a local hero who had brought the community together. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate him, and even the mayor sent a handwritten note thanking him for his efforts in fostering a sense of unity. Karen's antics, it seemed, had backfired spectacularly. Her attempts to paint Mark as a villain had only strengthened the community's bond. Mark couldn't help but find the irony delicious. As life settled into its new, Karen-free rhythm, Mark reflected on how much had changed. He had started out just wanting his driveway back, but somehow he'd ended up with a neighborhood that felt like family. He smiled as he pulled into his driveway one afternoon, enjoying the simple pleasure of parking without worrying about someone blocking his way. But just as he stepped out of his car, he noticed a new SUV parked across the street. His eyes narrowed. It wasn't Karen's, but something about it seemed familiar. The door of the SUV opened, and a woman in her 40s climbed out, holding a frappuccino in one hand. Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself. It could be nothing. It probably was nothing. But just in case, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened his camera app. Because if there was one thing Mark had learned, it was that where there was one Karen, there was always the possibility of another. And this time, he was ready from the very beginning. Smiling to himself, he whispered, "Bring it on."